Hey, it's Mazzy. Welcome back. What is it about San Francisco that seemed to destroy the careers of some bands? They either split up completely or they played their final public performance in San Francisco. Let's go back to August 29th, 1966. The Beatles perform in Candlestick Park. They never tour again. They never perform live in front of a paid audience again. Cut to 1976 Thanksgiving, the band, The Last Waltz, out of here. 1978, January 14th, the Sex Pistols play at Winterland, no more. And then the early 80s, I don't remember the exact time, Throbbing Gristle performed. I believe it was at Kaiser Pavilion, right on the edge of Golden Gate Park on Stanton Street. They played. They went away. Now, a couple of these bands reformed in various configurations. After that, but the crux here is San Francisco was it, and they moved on. And I'm sure there are others that can't think of off the top of my head. But I'm here to talk about the Sex Pistols because I want to celebrate, I guess. I don't know if celebration is the right word. But the first time this last concert from Winterland has been released on vinyl from January 14th, 1978. Of course, that's Bill Graham's Winterland Ballroom. I attended probably 200 shows there over a 10-year span. One of my favorite places. Old ice rink that had performances by the Ice Capades and Ice Follies. I used to go with my parents. And then I started going to a lot of shows there. Everyone from the Rolling Stones to Pink Floyd, to Tom Petty, to Bruce Springsteen, to ZZ Top, to Foghat, to Frank Zappa and the Mothers, to Little Feat, to Peter Frampton, all kinds of music, all kinds of rock and roll bands. It was a great venue and is a place that I love to go. Tickets usually were $4, $5, $6 for the most part, except for that last Waltz show. But that didn't include a Thanksgiving dinner. But this has never been released on vinyl. Of course, there are bootlegs out. There's been sort of, not sure if they're even official or unofficial CDs of this. And all over YouTube, you can find clips. And in fact, you can find the entire video from this performance. Bill Graham used to have a cameras set up, and they would video almost every performance at Winterland. And the radio station KSAN, KSAN in San Francisco, the premier rock station of the day, broadcast this live. I think it was hosted by the DJ Norm Davis, who I believe it was a night or two before, had a live interview and call-in with Sid Vicious, which is, you need to seek that out. And Bonnie Simmons, the program music director, was hosting this live broadcast. You can hear a very edited moment of her, but it's cut out. But you can hear her mostly on the YouTube clips. I attended the show, and I want to talk about this and a little bit of my punk cred, which isn't great, but I am that generation, the punk thing. And I think my first punk show probably would have been 2 nights in a row of the Ramones at the Savoy Tivoli in 1976. But the punk scene in San Francisco was really kind of starting in 1977, mainly because of 3 bands, I think, were the prominent bands playing around, and I saw them countless times. They were the Avengers, they were the Nuns, and Crime, and those 3 bands would play a lot. In fact, 2 of them would open up for this Winterland show. I'll get into that in a little bit. But then, of course, later, the harder core bands from LA would come through, and then the British bands, of course. And they're mostly playing the clubs. There were the Mabuhay Gardens, the Fab Mab. On Broadway upstairs, there was a larger venue, the Deaf Club over on Valencia Street, which was literally a club for deaf people, and they started having music. And then there were kind of some sub-venues and illegal pop-ups all around the city for a period of time into the 80s when the post-punk thing was happening. It was a really great, fertile time for music in San Francisco mixed in. Of course, Winterland didn't have a lot of punk shows. That wasn't their thing. And by the time the punk thing really caught on, Winterland was closed and dead. And the old Waldorf, I remember seeing Elvis Costello's very first American show there. The crossover into the new wave. orchestral maneuvers in the dark with the Go-Go's at the Market Street Cinema. But so a lot of the new wave bands, which are certainly not punk. I go down to L.A. and Madame Wong's. One band actually from L.A. that's still my favorite today, that are still hitting it, is X. I love X, and they have that little kind of crossover from punk to Americana now. That's how we see it. But this was a really interesting show. But let me go back, I don't know, maybe a month or so when I got this. Now, our store that I worked at, the Record Factory, was on Irving and 8th Avenue in the Inner Sunset, old Bank of America building with a balcony mezzanine with a used record shop. And I got the original first pressing of Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols on Virgin with that blank back. This is the one you want to get if you want that first one. Of course, it would come out on Warner Brothers, and this is like a hits record. This is a fantastic record produced by Chris Thomas, and this is their only studio album, one and done. Of course, Glenn Matlock was the original bass player in here, and he quits, I think, after just a couple of songs. Chris Thomas is doubtful of Sid Vicious. He only works on a song or two, so Steve Jones takes up the bass and plays bass on the rest of the songs on the album, and it's a killer record. But I say this was not a great show, but watching it now again on YouTube and playing this record, you sort of see things you didn't see at the time. I'll get into that in a little bit, but just to showcase a few singles that I picked up at the time, mostly imports here. God Save the Queen, this great artwork by Jamie Reed, his illustrations, one of the great, I think this is even in the National Portrait Gallery now in the UK in London. What a great, great record. This is backed with You Know Wrong. I also have Anarchy in the UK, band in the UK, Sex Pistols. I believe this is not this might be an American edition there, but I also have Pretty Vacant here. This is backed with No Fun. That's the song they close Winterland, and you really see the boredom, or the theatrical boredom of Johnny Rotten in that Winterland performance there. And of course, this is the UK, Pretty Vacant and Submission. I believe this is the UK. I could be wrong on this, but these are my singles. And of course, Holiday in the Sun. And this is backed with Satellite. I love these records. They're so great. Sex Pistols on Virgin Records. But it's so great that KSAN Radio broadcasts this live, because they weren't really a punk station. In fact, there were no punk stations. College radio really wasn't a thing yet. It would become a thing over the next few years in San Francisco, KUSF especially. But there was a show on late at night on the Norman Davis show. I think it was a punk hour or two with Chris Knab and Howie Klein. And Chris Knab was the owner of the infamous Aquarius Records. There's a documentary right now you can see on YouTube on Aquarius Records, the history of that great record store, originally in the Castro. I would go there in the 73, 74 when they first opened, pick up a lot of imports there. That was the place that I really got into the move. I think that was one of the bands that Chris Knab turned me on to, and Howie Klein, of course, would later start 415 Records and go on to be the president of Reprise Records in LA. But a really, great, great music fan, and really championed the whole punk new wave scene in San Francisco. The I-Beam would be a club too. I'd see The Cure, Billy Bragg, Echo and the Bunnyman. That was a gay club originally on Haight Street across from where now Amoeba is, up the block. But this wasn't a great show. I remember thinking, these guys are posers. And I remember specifically how bad Sid Vicious was on the bass. And I did listen to this. Now, this starts out kind of a lo-fi. The beginning of this is not very good, but it's more of a document. And I had to get it because I attended it. It's more of a document. But as I listen to it more, it gets better, especially as I get into side two. So it seems like they adjusted it, and it got really kind of good. And in terms of punk ethos, we know in punk history and Sonics, you're not in for the Sonics with these type of records. So I think this is really an interesting artifact of the time. They've released 3 concerts, I believe. They also, in the last month, released Atlantic show and a Dallas show. This is the only one I'm getting, just because I was there. I don't need to see the same whining and bitching by Johnny Rotten and the band that's on here. You hear the, some of the humor is the interchanges and the in between song banter and just the like, we don't give a shit, we're here type of thing. Something you would totally expect in this type of thing. To me, this kind of music and punk music worked better in the clubs. The Mabuhay, as I said, on Broadway was a great, great venue, and you'd be in the middle of things, and it was so great. So the thing about this show was they were the weakest band on the bill that night in terms of performance. Opening up was the Nuns. That's when Alejandro Escovedo was in the band. They were great. They were one of the big bands in San Francisco, or when I say big loosely, they were one of the prominent, most popular of the punk bands at the time. The other one would be the Avengers with Penelope Houston. Now, this is a great record. Some of the tracks here were recorded by Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols a month or 2 after that show, produced an EP that was out, and they didn't release, unfortunately, their first album. This didn't come out until 1983, but this is a great album. They were like the youngest and most powerful of these punk bands in San Francisco, and they had a sort of a different take on things. Of course, later we'd have the Dead Kennedys and so many other bands. It was a really fertile time in San Francisco, and not only the local bands that were like percolating all over, playing North Beach, south of Market, pop-up clubs all around, Haight Street, the Mission District. This was one of the best bands. The Nuns, again, were a primary, and of course, Crime was a great band too. I don't have any records here of theirs right now, but what a great band, and they burn brightly too, like all these bands. I think they reformed over the last decade or so, playing European tours and things. So I saw the Sex Pistols, the Avengers, and the Nuns on in that January show in San Francisco, Winterland. Then 2 months later, I made my first trip to the UK. Only saw 2 bands in London that first couple weeks. And then I went on to the continent for several months. But the bands I saw were Japan at Dingwall, something I just stumbled across. The other band I saw were The Damned, and I saw them at the Rainbow. I think it was in April of '78, and it was a fantastic show. I picked this album up, Import Stiff Island Records, produced by Nick Lowe. What a pivotal record in the whole UK punk scene, any punk scene, with this great wild cover there. But that was pretty much it. I would come back, and the whole punk thing, then post-punk thing was happening. In 1980, I went back to England, and while I was there, this movie opened, Julian Temple's The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. David and I, who were working on our Beatles England book in 1980, that would have been early spring of 1980, traveling around London, Wales, Liverpool, Hamburg, south to West Malling Airfield. But in London, we saw this movie, and I picked this soundtrack up. Who Killed Bambi? This has a couple of songs of note. It has My Way, the Sid Vicious song. I just realized how much of a bad musician he was. He was more of a personality. Rest in peace, Sid Vicious there. This has a good version of EMI, the orchestra version, which is kind of cliche. And the radio stations locally would play this. But a document of its time, a movie of its time, interesting film. The Sex Pistols, not a great performance at Winterland. Another shout out, a friend of mine who worked at KSAN for a while, Jim Draper, has a kind of a dormant channel, but he has one video that I had totally forgot about until this past week. And he set up and did the sound for the KSAN radio broadcast of that Sex Pistols show. And he made about a 20-minute video, which includes a handful of photographs he took of the Sex Pistols, repeated a lot, and interiors of Winterland. But it's a recording of the sound check of this Winterland show. There will be a link below to that because I think it's really interesting. If you're a fan of punk, a fan of historic concerts, watch that video. I think it has 300,000 views. It's been up for quite some time now. But you really kind of hear them getting the sound together, fucking around, completing partial songs, tuning up, getting the set together, and or at least the sound together. And I think it's a really great document of the Sex Pistols' last performance in San Francisco in 1978. Do I recommend this to anyone? Only if you're a completist. If you don't have this, this is the record to get. This is like one of the great punk albums of all time. And I think this is a magnificent album. Chris Thomas worked wonders with this band. It's a tight album, great singles, great hooks, wonderfully recorded in a punk way. You know, people talk about punk. Why do we need audiophile copies of these kind of records? I'm not saying we do, but this is a well-recorded record. Chris Thomas would produce the Pretenders and a lot of great new wave style bands, and he was a great engineer producer. This is a killer sounding record. Do you need this record if you have that? Only if you're a completist, only if you want to get everything and have a document of this time. For me, it's a no-brainer because I was there. But listen to YouTube, watch the whole thing. That's probably enough. In fact, it's probably a lot better seeing the visuals, and especially at the end when he's singing "No Fun." I guess that was the encore, the one song, the one encore. It's all you're gonna get on here. He looks so bored. In fact, he's sitting down. He couldn't be bothered. But that's kind of what Johnny Rotten and the band were about. Insert in this new release has some news clippings of that last tour. And the inner sleeve has the credits here. Live in the USA, 1978, Winterland Ballroom. Again, it's a series of 3 live records. Vocals, Johnny Lydon, it says here. Come on, we know who you are. Steve Jones on guitar. Sid Vicious posing as a bass player. And, of course, Paul Cook. And Paul Cook and Steve Jones are the heart of this. And Johnny Rotten, you have to love his personality and his perseverance here. And his, couldn't give a shit, but that's part of the act, too, that he continued for some time. But, interesting release, vintage release, archival release, the Sex Pistols, Winterland, 1978. Mazzy loves you. Thanks for watching.